All right, this is your reteach for Unit 5, Lesson 3, which is over tides. Hopefully on the front of Unit 5, Lesson 3, you remembered to write the little hints that I gave you. Spring and straight, meaning that spring tides occur when the sun, moon, and earth are lined up in a straight line. That's going to occur at new moon and full moon. New moon, remember the moon is between the sun and the earth. At full moon, the earth is between the sun and the moon. But everything's lined up in a straight line. Neap tides occur when things are lined up at a 90-degree angle. That would occur at first quarter and last quarter. Okay. Remember that spring tides are tidal ranges that are large, meaning there's a big difference between your high tide reading and your low tide reading for a day. Neap tides are tidal ranges that are small, meaning that your high tide and your low tide for a day, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. Okay? All right, so I wanted to point that out. There are a couple of other things that I want to point out before we get started. Remember, tides are just the daily changes in the level of ocean water. They're primarily caused by the moon. The sun has an influence also, but the moon is much closer to us, and the tidal force that it creates is greater than the tidal force of the sun. You have high tides occurring on the side of the earth that is facing the sun and on the side that's facing directly away from the sun. Low tides are going to occur at 90 degrees to that. Okay. You have extra high tides, remember, at your spring tides, which is new and full moon. You have lower than normal tidal range at neap tides. Remember that the entire tidal your cycle of spring tides, neap tides, and all of that is going to coincide with your lunar cycle, which takes 29 and a half days. So there's approximately a week between a spring tide day and a neap tide day, because a spring tide will occur at new moon, for instance, and then a neap tide will occur at first quarter. And then a spring tide will occur again at a full moon. Neap tide will occur at last quarter. And remember, there's no special name for tidal range on your waxing crescent and waxing gibbous and waning gibbous and waning crescent. Those don't have any special names. Okay. Also, I wanted to point out that on a particular day, there is about 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes between a high tide and then the low tide that follows it, and about 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes between a low tide and then the high tide that follows it. Why? Because the Earth is rotating once every 24 hours, and remember, you have high tides when that area on the Earth lines up with the moon. But remember, while the Earth is rotating, the moon is also moving in its orbit. So it takes 24 hours plus a little bit of extra time to catch up with where the moon is. Okay, so that complete tidal cycle starts over every 24 hours and 50 minutes, because remember, we have to turn a little bit more than one full rotation to catch up with where the moon is. Okay, so there's about 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes from high tide to low tide, 6 hours, 12 and a half minutes from low tide to high tide again. So if you think about it, it's about 12 hours and 25 minutes from high tide to the next high tide, or from low tide to the next low tide. Okay? So just keep all of that in mind. All right, let's look at our questions on the test. I'm going to start with number 23. Which of the following does not influence tide levels and when they occur? Okay, the rotation of the Earth on its axis. Yes, that affects tide levels, because remember, it's the areas that face the moon that are going to have high tides. Okay, so as the Earth rotates, the areas having high tides are going to change. The gravitational interaction between the sun and the Earth has an effect on tides. It's not as large of an effect as the tidal or the gravitational interaction between the moon and the Earth, but A, B, and C all affect tidal levels. Okay? and when they occur. The type of terrain found at a particular beach is not going to have any effect on when tidal, high tide and low tides occur. So your answer is going to be D. Number 24, a complete tidal cycle consists of, well, that's going to be 2 high tides and 2 low tides, okay? And it's going to take 24 hours and 50 minutes, like we said, okay? So 2 high tides and 2 low tides, 24 hours and 50 minutes, that's going to be answer F. Number 25, a high tide occurs at 3:15 p.m. When will the next high tide be? Well, it's going to be 12 hours and 25 minutes after the time they gave you. So 3:15 p.m. plus 12 hours is going to be 3:15 a.m., and then you've got to add the extra 25 minutes, so that's going to be 3:40 a.m. Okay, so your next high tide will be 12 hours and 25 minutes after 3:15 p.m. So that's C, 3:40 a.m. Okay, 26 and 27 are about lunar phases, so let's skip those. 28, 29, 30, 31, those were lunar phase questions. 32, which location on the graph indicates the largest tidal range? Well, where is the line stretched out the most? You have a large range at W, a big difference between your high tide levels and your low tide levels. You have a very small range at Y, not much difference between your high tide levels and your low tide levels. Z and X are sort of in between. So which location on the graph indicates the largest tidal range? That's going to be W. Remember, your large tidal range are going to go with spring tides, so this is probably either a new moon or a full moon. Okay. Your smallest tidal ranges are going to be neap tides, and those are going to occur at first quarter and last quarter moons. So on the graph at location Y, it's likely that the moon phase, or the phase of the moon, is either first or last quarter. And so of the choices you're given, that's going to be D. X and Z are probably, it's either waxing crescent or waxing gibbous or waning crescent or waning gibbous. Okay, it's not a spring or a neap tide situation at X and Z. Okay, let's go to the next question regarding tides. Number 34. Which situation would produce the smallest tidal ranges? Smallest tidal ranges are neap tides. Neap 90. Okay, that's going to be when things are lined up at 90 degrees. So which situation would produce the smallest tidal ranges? Situation 3 and 4. So that's J. Which locations would produce spring tides? Well, that's going to be when everything is lined up in a straight line, and that's going to be locations 1 and 2. All right, 36 and 37. Which date will have spring tides? And then 37, what's the tidal range? Okay, so you had to take a minute and look at the key. Here's your day. Here are your times. Here are your heights. Okay, high water. So that's a high tide, a low tide, a high tide, a low tide. Okay, range, remember, is the difference between high tide and low tide. Which date will have a spring tide? Well, they gave you a key. Here's new moon, full moon, first quarter, last quarter. Here is last quarter. Down here on the 27th is a new moon. And we know that new moons, everything's lined up in a straight line. That's going to be spring tides. So you're going to have spring tides on J, the 27th. And then 37, look at the tidal range for the 24th. Remember, range is biggest minus smallest. So your high tide is 5, your low tide is 1.1. I'm not going to use down here because that's not as big a range as here. So 5 minus 1.1 gives you 3.9. And I think that does it for the questions on Lesson 3. Yes, it does. Okay, so that does it for your reteach for tides, make sure you restudy so that you can retake the test when you get a chance.